Above all, to achieve sustainable development, we must choose peace over war. And it is no accident that the 17 SDGs culminate with SDG 16 calling for peaceful societies and SDG 17 calling for global cooperation. War is the great enemy of sustainable development. Of course, it devours resources, it destroys lives, and it diverts attention. It takes away the attention that we must have to face our challenges together with our neighbors and with countries around the world. I want to emphasize once again that war is a choice, and peace, therefore, is a choice against war. As I've referred to von Clausewitz's idea that war is the continuation of politics with other means, that is with military means, we can say that politics can enable us to avoid wars and to end wars if we are aware of the underlying political conditions. It's very useful to understand in any conflict the structural conditions that are pressing the two countries, perhaps, or the two belligerents to aim for war. And one famous way that is quite useful to think about this is as a strategic interrelation between two parties, what's known in formal social theory as game theory. We're not talking about games on a board game, we're talking about strategy that can lead to war. And it is useful to think about the strategic choices that two potential belligerents are making. If we consider two belligerents that are thinking, should we disarm or de-escalate, or should we arm or escalate a conflict, each side has to think about what is the right strategy. And in general, if we think about the circumstances of two countries that are thinking about whether to arm or disarm, we could say the following. If both countries disarm or de-escalate, they avoid war and they avoid the heavy costs of an arms race. If they both choose to escalate, they have to bear the heavy burdens of arms expenditures and perhaps the devastating costs of war. And so when we think about the strategic interactions of two countries facing the question of war or peace, it would seem, and it is typically the case, that peace is the mutually beneficial strategy. Don't go to war, it's expensive. It can be tragically expensive. It can be catastrophically expensive. If both sides choose to disarm and de-escalate, lo and behold, they save all those resources that would have been wasted or lost in war and can be used for human well-being in other ways. So it seems, and it is typically the case, that mutual de-escalation or mutual disarmament is a lot smarter and better for both sides than mutual armament, indeed mutual armament that leads to war. So what's the problem? It seems pretty obvious. Avoid war, good for both parties. Here's a rub that constantly intervenes. Consider one country saying, okay, should I arm or disarm? Well, if my opponent disarms, you know, if I continue to arm, I'm going to have a big military advantage. So if the opponent disarms, well, I could understand why the opponent would disarm, but if I say I will, but I actually build up my armaments, I'm going to be able to dictate the terms. So if my opponent disarms, you know what? I should actually arm. And if my opponent arms instead or escalates, oh my God, I have to escalate. So in fact, whatever my opponent does, whatever that other party does, it actually makes sense for me to arm up, to escalate. Because if they disarm, I'm going to have a big advantage. And if they arm, then I'm not going to be caught out vulnerable. The problem is that that leads to the conclusion, we should escalate, because no matter what our counterpart does, our adversary does, it's going to be better for us. But the other country is thinking the same thing. We don't know what our opponent is going to do, but if they de-escalate or disarm, we're going to have an advantage if we escalate, in fact, because we're going to have military superiority. And if they, in fact, choose to escalate, well, we had better escalate to be on the safe side. And so we're going to choose to escalate. Suddenly, the logic that we discovered that it would be better for both sides to disarm or de-escalate is turned on its head, because individually, each country reaches the conclusion, we just had better escalate, either to take advantage of the other side or to be on the safe side. And when both countries follow that logic, both escalate, neither gets a military advantage, but both bear heavy expenses of armaments and heavy risks of open warfare. So here is the basic dilemma, sometimes known as the prisoner's dilemma in game theory. It makes sense for two countries on the verge of war to step back, to disarm, to de-escalate, but it can be rational in a kind of way for each country individually to choose escalation, even though mutually both would be better off to de-escalate. So the question is, if it's mutually beneficial to avoid war, but individually rational in its strategic way to prepare for war, what to do? Well, if each side is separate and not talking with each other and only guessing at the objectives of the other side and thinking worse of the other side, it's not surprising that two countries will fall into war. They'll use the individual strategic logic, better to be safe than sorry. And if the other side is weak, we can take advantage. And following that logic, so-called, they'll end up in conflict. What to do? Well, I think the most basic lesson of history, and the one that is, at least in attempt or concept, embedded in the philosophy, the ethics, the logic, and the processes of the United Nations, is talk to the other side. Don't guess what the other side wants to do. Don't expect the worst. Don't try to trick the other side. Sit down with your opponent. Sit down with your strategic adversary and reason together and say, you know what? We will both be better off. If we de-escalate and disarm, we can avoid this conflict. Let's do it together. Now, unfortunately, history doesn't always go this way, but it sometimes does go this way. In one of the most harrowing and terrifying moments in modern world history, when the Soviet Union and the United States were facing off against each other in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, President Kennedy and Chairman Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the United States and the leader of the Soviet Union, were told by their strategic advisors, we had better escalate. On each side, the advice was prepare for war. But the two leaders, President Kennedy and President Khrushchev, even though they weren't in direct contact, they were sending messages, and they were each coming to realize that they were both in the same boat. They were both in the same strategic situation, hearing from their own advisors to go to war, but knowing that the logic, in fact, the survival of the planet, dictated that they find the way to mutually de-escalate and stand down. And in fact, at that harrowing moment in history, they reached a mutual understanding, almost by intuition, that the other was not their real enemy, but was their real partner in mutual de-escalation. They agreed to each remove missiles that were in the neighborhood of the other side, and thereby remove the tensions and find a way to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And thank God, that's why we're here. They avoided thermonuclear war in October 1962. The world survived, and remarkably, in the following year, they went from being enemies on the brink of global war to being partners in signing a crucial treaty, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which put the world on a far safer course. What President Kennedy and Chairman Nikita Khrushchev of the United States and the Soviet Union respectively proved is that it is possible to find a way to cooperation, even at the height of a conflict, and to avoid war and to recognize the common interests in peace.